Every September, when Britain remembers the Battle of Britain, one silhouette owns the sky. The elliptical wing, the slender fuselage, the Spitfire. But the fighter that actually won the Battle of Britain is the one Britain forgot. It destroyed more German aircraft in that summer of 1940 than the Spitfire and every other British defence combined. More than the anti-aircraft guns, more than the balloons, more than everything else put together. And within a generation, it had been written out of its own victory. It was called the Hurricane. This is the story of how it won, and why the winning was not enough to be remembered.
The forgetting started while the battle was still being fought. In the late summer of 1940, German pilots pulled from the Channel or captured in Kent kept telling their interrogators the same thing. They had been shot down by a Spitfire. Their squadron mates filed the same claim in combat reports over France. The RAF officers taking these statements noticed a pattern, because on many of those days, in those sectors, at those altitudes, there had been no Spitfires anywhere near the fight. There had been hurricanes. The Luftwaffe had invented a phrase for the phenomenon before the British did: Spitfire snobbery. It was, apparently, more honourable to be beaten by a thoroughbred. Nobody wanted to have been killed by a workhorse.
Even Hermann Goering got a version of it. In the autumn of 1940, with the battle going wrong, the head of the Luftwaffe gathered his fighter commanders and demanded to know what they needed to win. Adolf Galland, 28 years old, already one of Germany's leading aces, gave the answer that became famous: a squadron of Spitfires. It is one of the most quoted lines of the entire air war. Read the loss ledgers of Galland's own opponents that summer, and the line collapses. The aircraft doing the majority of the killing was not the one he asked for. The most cutting insult in the Luftwaffe's vocabulary named the wrong plane.
So the question this film has to answer is not just how the Hurricane won the most important air battle in history. It is stranger than that. How does a machine win, measurably, arithmetically, in the cold accounting of wreckage scattered across the fields of southern England, and still lose the memory? To get there, we have to start with the man who built it. Because the Hurricane was not an accident of production schedules. It was a deliberate answer to a question nobody else in Britain was asking. And the man asking it had spent his whole life building the very biplanes his new fighter would make extinct.
Sidney Camm was born in Windsor in 1893, the eldest of 12 children of a carpenter. He left school at 15. No university, no engineering degree. He learned aircraft the way his father learned wood, by hands and by failure, building model aeroplanes and then real ones, working his way up through the Hawker Company, until by the mid-1920s, he was its chief designer. Through that decade and into the next, Camm's biplanes were the Royal Air Force. The Fury, the Heart, the Demon. Elegant, fabric-covered machines with 2 wings and open cockpits, built around a design grammar Hawker's factories and the RAF's mechanics knew by heart. Camm was famously difficult, famously exacting, and famously unsentimental. Which mattered, because in 1933, he concluded that everything he had built was obsolete.
The future was the monoplane. One wing, cleaner lines, higher speeds, and everyone in aviation knew it. What they disagreed about
was how to get there. In Germany, Willy Messerschmitt was designing the Bf 109 as a clean sheet exercise in modernity. All metal stressed skin, everything new at once. At Supermarine, Reginald Mitchell was doing the same with what would become the Spitfire. A monocoque aluminium shell, curved and hand-formed, the airframe itself carrying the loads, a masterpiece that owed almost nothing to what came before it. Camm looked at the same future and made the opposite bet. His monoplane would be new where new bought performance, and old everywhere else. Deliberately, calculatedly old.
He started, quite literally, with what he had. The project that became the Hurricane began on Camm's drawing boards as the Fury monoplane. His existing biplane fighter, with the top wing deleted and the structure rethought around a single low wing. Underneath the skin, the construction was pure Hawker tradition. A skeleton of steel tubes, joined and braced, with wooden formers and stringers shaping the fuselage, the whole thing covered in doped fabric. It was the way Hawker had built fighters for 15 years. Every jig in the factory, every skill in the workforce, every rigger and fitter in every RAF squadron already understood it. Onto that Victorian skeleton, Camm grafted the future. An enclosed cockpit, a retractable undercarriage, and the new Rolls-Royce engine, then called the PV-12, soon to be renamed the Merlin. Understand what this was, because it is the hinge of the entire story. Mitchell was answering the question every great designer wants to answer. What is the best fighter I can build? Camm was answering a different one. What is the best fighter Britain can actually produce, in numbers, in time, with the factories and the hands it already has, and then keep flying once the shooting starts? The first question produces a thoroughbred. The second produces the Hurricane. In 1935, the distinction looked academic. In 1940, it would be measured in squadrons.
The armament settled the design's purpose. British air staff studies in the mid-1930s had reached a grim conclusion. Against modern bombers at closing speeds of hundreds of miles an hour, a pilot might hold his sights on target for 2 seconds. 2 seconds had to be enough to destroy the aircraft. The answer was mass of fire. 8 Browning machine guns in .303 caliber. More guns than any production fighter in the world then carried. And here, Camm's thick, old-fashioned wing paid its first dividend. The Hurricane's wing was deep enough to swallow 4 guns aside in tight clusters close to the fuselage, with easy access panels for the armourers. The Spitfire's thin, beautiful wing would force its guns far apart along the span. The ugly wing made the steadier gun battery. It would not be the last time the Hurricane's crudeness turned out to be load-bearing. On the 6th of November, 1935, at Brooklands Aerodrome in Surrey, Hawker's chief test pilot, George Bullman, opened the throttle on prototype K5083 and lifted the first Hurricane off the grass. Bullman was a small, precise, bald man who had been testing Camm's aircraft for a decade, and his verdict after landing was characteristically brief. The machine was easy. Docile off the ground, docile back onto it, viceless in between. In the trials that followed,
The prototype exceeded 315 miles per hour. This from an aircraft whose rear fuselage was still, essentially, wire-braced steel tube and Irish linen. The RAF had never possessed a fighter that could pass 300. 4 months later, Mitchell's Spitfire prototype flew and proved faster still. But the calendar had already started mattering more than the stopwatch. Germany was rearming in the open now. The question was no longer which fighter was better, it was which fighter could exist in quantity before the war arrived.
In June 1936, the Air Ministry ordered 600 Hurricanes, one of the largest orders for a military aircraft Britain had ever placed in peacetime. But the decision that would shape the Battle of Britain had already been taken 3 months earlier, in a Hawker boardroom, before any contract was signed. The company's directors, reading the same newspapers as everyone else, authorized tooling and materials for 1,000 Hurricanes on their own financial risk. No government order, no guarantee. If peace held, the gamble could have broken the company. Instead, when the contracts came, Hawker was already months ahead of them. Those months, bought with private money against the calendar of a dictator, would translate 4 years later into squadrons that existed instead of squadrons on paper.
The Spitfire's early production history was the mirror image, and it proves the point of Camm's bet better than any argument. Mitchell's design was a masterpiece that Britain's aircraft industry did not yet know how to mass produce. The elliptical wing, the compound curves of that monocoque shell, much of it had to be formed by skilled hands, panel by panel, and there were nowhere near enough such hands. The numbers tell it plainly. A Hurricane airframe took roughly 10,300 man-hours to build. A Spitfire took about 15,200. For every 2 Spitfires, the same labor could deliver 3 Hurricanes. Supermarine's production stalled and slipped through 1937 and into 1938, while Hurricanes flowed out of Kingston and Brooklands on proven jigs, built by men doing what they had done for years, only faster.
The first production Hurricanes reached number 111 Squadron at RAF Northolt in December 1937. The RAF's first operational fighter capable of more than 300 miles per hour. Its first with 8 guns. Its first of the new monoplane generation. The Spitfire did not reach its first squadron until August 1938, 8 months behind. And when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and Britain went to war 2 days later, the ledger read like this. Around 550 Hurricanes, equipping 18 squadrons, against roughly 300 Spitfires. Fighter Command's shield, on the day it was raised, was 2/3 Hurricane. Nobody in Britain that week was confused about which fighter mattered more. The confusion came later. The war tested Camm's second question. Could the thing keep flying once the shooting started, before it tested the first? When the RAF sent fighters to France in September 1939 to stand alongside the French army, it sent Hurricanes, and only Hurricanes. This was partly Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, hoarding his precious Spitfires for home defence, but it was also a cold technical judgment. France meant rough grass fields, mud, improvised maintenance far from proper depots. The Hurricane's wide-set undercarriage pitch handled surfaces that would have snapped the Spitfire's narrow, inward-folding legs. Its steel tube and fabric body could be patched by a fitter with a tube of dope and a square of linen. The thoroughbred stayed home. The workhorse went to war.
On the 30th of October, 1939, near Toul, a 19-year-old pilot officer of No. 1 Squadron named Peter Mould dived his Hurricane onto a Dornier reconnaissance aircraft and shot it down. The first German aircraft destroyed by an RAF fighter on the Western Front in the Second World War. Through the strange, quiet winter that followed, the Phony War, Hurricane pilots in France duelled German reconnaissance machines and learned their trade. Then, on the 10th of May, 1940, the quiet ended. The Wehrmacht came through the Ardennes, the Luftwaffe came over the top of it, and the Hurricane squadrons in France were thrown into a battle that consumed everything.
They fought well, and it did not matter. Outnumbered, operating from fields that were overrun every few days, flying 4 and 5 sorties a day against an air force with the initiative, the Hurricanes in France inflicted real losses on the Luftwaffe and absorbed catastrophic ones themselves. Aircraft shot down, aircraft burned on the ground, aircraft simply abandoned, unserviceable in the retreat. London kept ordering more squadrons across the Channel. The French government begged for them, and in the middle of May, the man responsible for the air defence of Britain decided the bleeding had to stop.
On the 16th of May, 1940, Hugh Dowding wrote a letter to the Air Ministry that has a strong claim to being one of the decisive documents of the war. In it, he laid out the arithmetic with icy clarity. He stated the minimum fighter strength needed to defend Britain, showed how far below it fighter command had already fallen, and warned that if the drain to France continued, the result would be the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of the country. Note what the drain was made of. It was Hurricanes. The aircraft being consumed in France, the aircraft whose loss rate threatened Britain's survival, the aircraft Dowding was fighting his own government to conserve. The entire calculation was denominated in Hurricanes. The letter worked. The tap was tightened. Fighter command would meet the summer with its strength battered, but intact.
There was one more rehearsal. Over the beaches of Dunkirk, from the 26th of May to the 4th of June, Fighter Command flew cover for the evacuation of the British Army. And for the first time, Spitfires and Hurricanes fought over the same ground against the Luftwaffe's main strength. The 14 Hurricane squadrons engaged were credited with 108 victories in those 9 days. 27 Hurricane pilots became aces during the operation. And on the German side, a few of the more thoughtful officers registered something unwelcome. Over Dunkirk, at the edge of its fuel range, the Luftwaffe had been fought to a standstill for the first time. Galland himself would later write that the air battles over those beaches should have been read as a warning. They were not. By the end of June 1940, France had surrendered, the Channel was the front line, and the ledger of Fighter Command read as follows: 61 fighter squadrons, of which 31 flew Hurricanes. Through the battle to come, the proportion would hold. Roughly 32 Hurricane squadrons and 19 of Spitfires at the height of it. Close to 2 Hurricanes for every Spitfire. Say the sentence plainly, because 4 decades of films have obscured it. The fighter force that met the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940 was mostly Hurricanes. Whatever the Battle of Britain was going to be, arithmetic had already decided which aircraft would have to carry the weight of it.
But the Hurricanes were not fighting alone. And to understand what they did, you have to understand the machine they were plugged into. Along the coasts of southern and eastern England stood the tall masts of Chain Home. Radar, the first integrated air defense network in the world, able to see raids forming over France while the German aircraft were still climbing. The masts fed plots to Fighter Command headquarters. Headquarters fed them to the group and sector operations rooms, and the sector controllers scrambled squadrons with vectors, altitudes, and timing. The system meant Fighter Command almost never had to patrol and hope. It could spend its fighters precisely, sending them where the raid would be. What the system needed from an aircraft was not brilliance. It needed availability. Machines that were serviceable this morning, again this afternoon, and again tomorrow. It needed, in other words, exactly the qualities Sidney Camm had designed for in 1934.
The tactical division of labour followed the aircraft's natures. Where the controllers could arrange it, the Spitfires, faster, better in the climb, at their best up high, went for the escorting Messerschmitt Bf 109s, while the Hurricane squadrons drove at the bombers. It was never a rigid rule. A squadron scrambled late took whatever the sky gave it, and plenty of Hurricanes tangled with 109s and plenty of Spitfires shot down bombers. But the tendency was real, and it handed the Hurricane the job that decided the battle. The Luftwaffe's fighters could not invade Britain. The bombers were the weapon, the instrument meant to smash the airfields, the radar, the aircraft factories. Killing bombers was the entire strategic point of Fighter Command's existence. The unglamorous assignment was the one the war actually turned on.
And at that job, the Hurricane was a specialist's tool wearing a farmhand's clothes. It was a famously steady gun platform. The thick wing and stable handling let a pilot hold his aim through the storm of a bomber formation's crossfire in a way the twitchier, more sensitive Spitfire made harder. Its 8 Brownings sat in 2 tight clusters, their fire converging in a dense cone. Pilots learned to bore in close, put 2 seconds into a Heinkel's wing root or an engine, and break away. The Hurricane's cockpit sat high above that humped nose, giving a gun sight view German bomber crews came to know precisely. A Heinkel H-111 or a Dornier 17 caught by a Hurricane section at converging angles was not being duelled, it was being dismantled.
The battle opened officially on the 10th of July 1940 over the Channel convoys, and it was Hurricanes of No. 145 Squadron that were recorded firing its first shots on the 8th of August. Through July, the Luftwaffe probed the convoys and the coast. In August, it came for Fighter Command itself. On the 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day, Goering launched the assault meant to sweep the RAF from the sky in weeks. And the fighting entered the phase that pilots on both sides would remember as simple attrition.
Raid after raid, scramble after scramble. 4, 5, 6 sorties a day. Airfields cratered, sector stations burning, and the entire question of the war reduced to which side's arithmetic broke first.
Arithmetic was the Hurricane's native language. Here is what the newsreels never showed. A Hurricane comes back to its field with a line of cannon strikes through the rear fuselage. If it were a Spitfire, that is a job for skilled metal workers, panel beating, riveting, possibly a ferry flight to a repair depot, the aircraft gone from the order of battle for days. On the Hurricane, a rigger cuts away the torn linen, inspects the steel tubes beneath, which more often than not are untouched, because a shell that meets fabric frequently passes straight through without exploding, patches the hole, paints on the dope, and the aircraft is on the dawn state board. Squadron ground crews performed these resurrections through the nights of August by the hundreds. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers, counting British fighters they had assessed as destroyed, kept meeting them again the following morning.
The same logic ran through the whole national repair system. Damaged Hurricanes that did need depot work moved through the civilian repair organization and returned to squadrons in a steady stream. Hundreds of rebuilt fighters over the course of the battle, a shadow production line running on salvage. Meanwhile, the factories at Kingston, Brooklands and Langley kept delivering new ones at a rate the simplest structure made possible. Fighter Command's crisis that summer was never really aircraft. It was pilots. And even there, the Hurricane quietly helped, because Bullman's verdict from 1935 still held. The machine was easy. A 19-year-old with a few dozen hours on trainers could be sent to a Hurricane squadron and stand a fair chance of surviving his own landings. The same boy posted to Spitfires, with that narrow undercarriage and that long blind nose, faced better odds of wrecking the aircraft before ever meeting a German. In a battle decided by availability of machines and of the men inside them, forgiveness was a weapon.
The men inside them deserve more than a summary, because the Hurricane's story in that summer is carried by names the Spitfire legend later crowded out. Begin with the squadron that outscored every other unit in Fighter Command. Number 303 Squadron formed in August 1940 at Northolt, built around Polish airmen who had already fought the Luftwaffe twice. Over Poland in September 1939, over France in May 1940, and had escaped both defeats, carrying a hatred of the enemy that their British commanders found slightly alarming. They flew Hurricanes. In roughly 6 weeks of combat, they were credited with 126 German aircraft destroyed, the highest total claimed by any squadron in the battle, with a loss rate far below the average. The RAF had initially hesitated to commit the Poles at all, doubting their discipline and their English. By late September, sector controllers were sending 303 into the largest raids on purpose.
And inside that squadron flew the highest-scoring Allied pilot of the entire Battle of Britain, who was not British and not even Polish. Józef František was a Czech, a pre-war Air Force sergeant who had refused to accept the occupation of his country, escaped to Poland, fought there, escaped again, fought for France, and escaped a third time to England, where he attached himself to the Poles of 303. In the air, he was ungovernable. He would abandon formation the moment contact came and hunt alone, a habit that should have killed him in days. Instead, in the single month of September 1940, flying a Hurricane, František destroyed 17 German aircraft. No pilot in Fighter Command, in any aircraft, scored higher in the battle. He died on the 8th of October, crashing on a routine patrol, exhausted,
26 years old.
The top gun of Britain's most mythologized battle was a Czech sergeant in a hurricane, and almost nobody outside the histories knows his name. Or take the 16th of August over Southampton. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of No. 249 Squadron was jumped by Messerschmitt 110s. Cannon shells wrecked his Hurricane's cockpit, wounded him in the eye and foot, and set the reserve fuel tank alight. Burning, half-blinded, in the act of bailing out, Nicholson saw a 110 slide in front of his windscreen. He sat back down in the fire, took the controls, and shot it down. Then went over the side with his hands and face burned raw, and survived a Home Guard shotgun blast on the way down for good measure. He received the Victoria Cross. It was the only VC awarded to a pilot of RAF Fighter Command in the entire Second World War. Every schoolchild's image of that summer is a Spitfire. The one Fighter Command pilot the highest decoration actually went to earned it strapped inside a burning Hurricane.
Nicholson's fire points at the darkest chapter of the Hurricane story, and this film will not skip it. The Hurricane carried a reserve fuel tank in the fuselage, directly behind the engine and directly in front of the instrument panel, which is to say, directly in front of the pilot's face. In the early battle, it was unprotected. When it caught, the cockpit filled with a blowtorch, and a pilot had perhaps seconds to get the hood open and get out through the flame. Many made it, with their hands, which had been on the controls, and their faces, which the goggles and mask only partly covered, terribly burned. The RAF's casualty wards began filling that summer, with young men injured in a way medicine had rarely confronted at scale.
They were sent to a cottage hospital at East Grinstead in Sussex, to a New Zealand plastic surgeon named Archibald Mackindo, and what happened there became one of the war's strange, humane legends. Mackindo was rebuilding faces and hands with techniques he was partly inventing as he went, operation after operation, sometimes dozens per man. Just as radically, he rebuilt the men. He threw out the convalescent blues uniform, sent his patients into the town's pubs, recruited the locals to treat scarred and grafted young men as neighbours rather than horrors. His patients formed a drinking club and named it, with pitch-black airman's humour, the Guinea Pig Club, because that is what they were, guinea pigs for a new surgery. Hundreds of members by war's end, a high proportion of them Hurricane pilots, bound for life to each other and to the surgeon they called the boss. Armour and self-sealing protection for the Hurricane tanks came, but too late for the founders. It is part of the Hurricane's ledger too. The machine that could absorb punishment did not always spare the man inside it.
Through late August and early September, the battle ground toward its crisis. The Luftwaffe was hitting the sector airfields, Kenley, Biggin Hill, Manston, and hurting them badly. Fighter Command's pilot losses were outrunning replacement. Then, in the first week of September, the German effort swung to London, and the pressure on the airfields lifted at the moment it might have become decisive. On the 15th of September, the day Britain now marks as Battle of Britain Day, Goering sent his largest coordinated attack against the capital, and the Dowding system met it with everything, squadron after squadron feeding into the raids, the majority of them Hurricanes. By evening, the Luftwaffe had suffered losses it could not explain to itself from an air force it had assessed as beaten weeks earlier. 2 days later, on the 17th of September, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The battle sputtered on into October, but the verdict was in. For the first time, somewhere, the German war machine had been fought and stopped.
Now count. Fighter Command's own accounting through the battle credited its squadrons with 2,739 German aircraft destroyed. Of those, 55% fell to Hurricanes and 42% to Spitfires, with the small remainder shared among everything else. Post-war research trimmed the totals on both sides, as it always does. Claims made at 300 miles an hour in a 3-second fight are honest overcounts. But the proportion held because it was structural. More Hurricane squadrons, meeting more of the raids, assigned more often to the bombers. Roughly 6 of every 10 German aircraft destroyed in the Battle of Britain were destroyed by Hurricanes, more than the Spitfire and all other defences combined. There is no serious historical dispute about this. The aircraft that won the Battle of Britain, by the only measure that mattered to Germany's invasion planners, was the Hawker Hurricane. Hold that sentence. Now watch it disappear.
The erasure had already begun, and the first authors of it, as we saw, were the Germans, the downed pilots insisting on Spitfires, Galland asking Goering for Spitfires. But the British took up the work with enthusiasm, and to understand why, you have to look at the two aircraft the way a newsreel camera did. The Spitfire is one of the most beautiful machines human beings have ever made. The ellipse of that wing, the way the fuselage tapers, it photographs like the future. It sounds like victory. The Hurricane beside it is a hunched, hump-backed thing, with its biplane ancestry showing through the fabric. One of them looks like the war Britain wanted to believe it was fighting. Modern, brilliant, improbable. The other looks like the war Britain was actually fighting. Improvised, industrial, held together by riggers with dope brushes at 4 a.m.
Propaganda follows beauty. The wartime Spitfire funds, towns and factories and colonial cities raising money to buy fighters for the nation, could in principle name any aircraft, but the word that opened wallets was Spitfire, and the Air Ministry knew it and fed the legend on purpose. It was a genuinely brilliant piece of national morale engineering, and it worked. The cost was accounting. Each retelling through the war and after, each newsreel, each memoir serialized in the papers, each anniversary, compounded the Spitfire's share of the story a little further. By the time the great films were made in the decades after the war, the summer of 1940 had a single hero aircraft, and the fighter that shot down the majority of the Luftwaffe appeared, when it appeared at all, as the supporting act. Ask what won the Battle of Britain, and the national memory answers with the name of the runner-up.
There is a crueler irony underneath, and it is the kind this channel exists for. The very qualities that won the battle are the qualities that cost the Hurricane the legend. It was easy to build, so there was nothing miraculous to narrate. It was easy to fly, so its pilot's survival looked unremarkable. It was easy to repair, so its victories accumulated in maintenance logs instead of anecdotes. The Spitfire's story is a story about excellence, and excellence makes heroes. The Hurricane story is a story about availability, and availability makes statistics. Nations remember heroes. Nobody builds a monument to serviceability rates, even when serviceability rates are what stood between the nation and invasion. And here is what the legend
having written the hurricane out of 1940, never had to deal with at all. The Hurricanes' war was just beginning. While the Spitfire settled into its role as the RAF's premier interceptor at home, the Hurricane went everywhere else. And everywhere else is where most of the Second World War happened. Its second life is barely known in Britain, and it is astonishing. It went to Malta, when that besieged rock in the Mediterranean was the most bombed place on Earth. And for critical months, hurricanes flown off carriers were the island's fighter defense, holding the line against the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe, until Spitfires could finally be spared. It went to North Africa, where the desert did to aircraft what France had done: rough strips, sand, maintenance in the open, and where the hurricane's ruggedness made it the workhorse of the Desert Air Force. And there it evolved into something Camm had never drawn: the Hurricane Mark IID, with a 40mm cannon slung under each wing, a flying anti-tank gun that dived on Rommel's armour at turret height. Squadrons of these tank busters earned the nickname that tells you everything about the aircraft's third career: the can openers. It went to sea, in one of the most desperate expedients of the entire war. In 1941, with German Focke-Wulf Condors ranging over the Atlantic convoys beyond the reach of any land-based fighter, the Admiralty fitted merchant ships with rocket catapults and bolted a single Hurricane to each one. These were the Camm ships, and their fighters, Hurricats the sailors called them, were launched one way. There was no deck to land on. The pilot flew his interception, and then, if he was beyond range of land, he bailed out or ditched into the North Atlantic beside the convoy, and prayed the escort reached him before the cold did. Men volunteered for this. Proper sea hurricanes with arrestor-hooks followed on carriers, where the aircraft's forgiving manners and wide undercarriage made it a far safer deck aircraft than the early naval Spitfires. It went to Burma, holding the sky over the longest retreat and the hardest jungle front of the British War. And it went to Russia.
Almost 3,000 Hurricanes, nearly 1 in 5 of all ever built, were shipped to the Soviet Union from 1941 onward. The first Western aircraft supplied in quantity to the Red Air Force, with RAF squadrons initially deploying to Murmansk to fly alongside Soviet pilots and convert them onto the type. Soviet airmen grumbled about the Hurricane, compared it unfavorably to their newest fighters, rearmed it with their own cannon, and flew it in the Arctic, off frozen strips, through a winter war on the most brutal front in history, because it was there, it worked, and it kept working. Availability again. The Hurricane's entire biography is that single word, wearing different uniforms.
The production story ended the way it had run throughout, in quantity. Hurricanes were built not only in England, but across the Atlantic, where the Canadian Car and Foundry Company turned out more than 1,400 of them, a line overseen by its chief aeronautical engineer, Elsie McGill, the first woman in the world to hold an aeronautical engineering degree, whom the wartime press crowned the Queen of the Hurricanes. A polio survivor who walked with 2 canes and signed off on production aircraft she was never able to fly herself, McGill ran the engineering of a fighter plant, feeding a war an ocean away. One more unlikely name in the roster of people the Hurricane's forgotten story is made of. When the last Hurricane rolled out at Langley in July 1944, its fuselage carried a painted inscription, "The last of the many." The total stood at 14,483. Camm's deliberately old-fashioned fighter had outlasted its own obsolescence by half a war on every front the war possessed.
So return, at the end, to the question the film opened with. How does a machine win and still lose the memory? You now have the answer, and it is uncomfortable. Because the answer is that we, the audiences, the newsreel watchers, the filmmakers, the school children with our pictures of elliptical wings, chose the story over the ledger. The ledger says 2/3 of fighter command, roughly 6 of every 10 German aircraft destroyed, the top-scoring pilot, the top-scoring squadron, the battle's only Victoria Cross, and then 5 more years of war on every front, while the legend stayed home and posed. The story says Spitfire. The ledger was written by riggers and armourers and a Czech sergeant and a carpenter's son from Windsor. The story was written by everyone who found the ledger insufficiently beautiful.
Sidney Camm was knighted and went on to design the Typhoon, the Tempest, and in his 70s, the Harrier jump jet, one of the few men whose drawing board spans fabric biplanes and vectored thrust jets. He never made peace with his first monoplane's eclipse. Those who worked with him recalled that praise for the Spitfire in his presence was a known hazard. He had built the answer to the correct question. Not the best fighter imaginable, but the best fighter buildable, flyable, and fixable in the time history allowed. And he lived long enough to watch the wrong aircraft collect the credit at every anniversary. If the P-47 story taught that a system built for replication defeats a system built for perfection, the Hurricane story adds the bitter corollary. Replication wins wars, and perfection wins the memory of them.
Perhaps that is the real reason to tell this story now. While a handful of Hurricanes still fly at the air shows, holding formation beside the Spitfires that outshine them one more time. Somewhere in the crowd, a child points at the beautiful one. Nobody corrects her. But the next time you see that pair cross the sky together, look at the humpbacked shape on the wing of the legend and know what you are actually looking at. The fighter that was there first, in the largest numbers, on the worst days, at the point of decision. The fighter that won a battle Britain forgot. The forgetting was our failure. The winning was never in doubt.
The Hurricane didn't lose the Battle of Britain's memory because it did too little. It lost it because it made winning look ordinary. That's the Arsenal Files. And if machines like this one deserve to be remembered properly, the subscribe button is how you tell the algorithm to keep these stories coming. One question for the comments. Which forgotten workhorse should get this treatment next? The Wildcat, the Il-2, or the Wellington? I read every one.